The 31st floor of Meridian Financial Group's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, was not built for men like Calvin Reed. Every detail of it announced this without apology. The Italian marble floors. The floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light off Peachtree Street like a mirror turned toward the sun. The long walnut conference table, surrounded by 14 leather chairs, each one worth more than Calvin earned in 2 months. The room smelled like confidence and imported coffee, and the particular certainty of people who had never once questioned their right to be precisely where they were. Calvin was crouched behind the AV credenza in the far corner, a Phillips head in his right hand and a service ticket in his back pocket, doing what he always did in rooms like this, making himself disappear. He had been making himself disappear for 7 years. He had become very good at it. The fault was where it almost always was. The signal cable at the back of the switch unit had worked loose from its housing, the slow consequence of 100 presentations and 100 people pushing cables aside without thinking. Calvin tightened the collar, pressed the power button on the wall panel, watched the display come up from black to full brightness. He was already reaching for his toolkit, already somewhere else in his head, already thinking about the job on the 22nd floor and the one after that and the one after that. Then the presentation loaded. He saw the logo first, a geometric hexagon in dark blue, 3 vertices marked in gold. A design he had sketched on the back of a lease agreement on a Wednesday night in 2016, sitting at his kitchen table in Decatur while his daughter slept in the next room, and the whole future felt like something he was building with his own hands. He read the title on the screen. Nova 4.0, Southeast and Gulf Coast Institutional Deployment Strategy, presented by Thomas Wicker, Chief Innovation Officer, Meridian Financial Group. Calvin did not move. He did not reach for his toolkit. He picked up the presentation clicker from the conference table instead, the way a man picks up a tool he already knows how to use, and he scrolled to slide 4. When he saw the number in the 3rd column of the 7th row, something settled inside him. Not anger, something older than anger, quieter. The thing that had been sitting in his chest for 7 years like a stone he had learned to carry without mentioning. He was still standing at the screen when the conference room doors opened. If you're new here, this channel is for the stories the news cycle misses, but probably shouldn't. Stories about ordinary people, extraordinary moments, and what gets revealed when the pressure is high enough. Hit subscribe and keep watching, because what happens in the next 40 minutes is the kind of thing most people never get to see. Calvin Reed woke up every morning at 5 o'clock. Not because he had to, because the space between sleep and full wakefulness was the only part of the day that still felt like it belonged entirely to him, and he had learned to protect it. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building on Flat Shoals Road in East Atlanta, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that looked out over a parking lot and, beyond that, the tops of the oak trees that lined the street. It was not the kind of place he had imagined living when he was 31 years old. He had imagined something different then. He had imagined a lot of things then. He would stand at the counter while the coffee brewed, in that narrow window before his mind fully assembled all of its contents. And sometimes in that window he would forget. He would feel like himself, the earlier self. The man who used to walk into rooms and speak with the particular authority of someone who had built something real and knew it all the way down to its foundation. Then the coffee would finish, and Calvin Reed would remember exactly where he was and how he had gotten there. His daughter Nora was 22 now, living in a 1-bedroom in Midtown and working at a graphic design firm she had found herself. The way she found everything, quietly and without asking for help, she didn't need. She had her mother's patience and Calvin's precise way of looking at problems. She called him every Sunday evening, and they talked about whatever she felt like talking about, which was usually design, sometimes food, occasionally the particular frustrations of being young in a city that moved fast and remembered nothing. Her mother, Diana, had left 5 years ago, not with cruelty. There had been no lawyers, no screaming, no dramatic collapse into accusation and counter-accusation. There had been one long conversation at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in which Diana had said, with the careful honesty of a woman who had rehearsed this many times, that she had married a man who built things, and she did not know the man who now spent his days fixing other people's broken things. She was not wrong. He had not argued. What Calvin had lost when he lost Meridian was not just the work. It was the version of himself that the work had made possible. The version that had walked into rooms without calculating in advance whether he was allowed to be there. He had a folder on his laptop he had not opened in 3 years. It was labeled Nova Original. Inside were over 900 pages of documentation, source code, architecture drawings, development logs, internal emails, patent filings bearing his name that had traveled through a legal process he still did not fully understand and emerged bearing someone else's. He had not opened the folder because opening it meant wanting something. And wanting things, he had learned, was a kind of exposure he could no longer afford. What had happened 7 years ago was this. Calvin had spent 4 years building Nova from nothing. An adaptive financial risk management system designed specifically for mid-size institutional investors navigating volatile regional markets. He had written the code in the evenings after Nora went to bed. He had developed the mathematical framework during his lunch breaks. He had run stress tests on a server he had bought secondhand and kept in the spare bedroom. Nova was not flashy, it was precise. Every design decision had a reason. Every variable had a name that meant something to the man who chose it. Thomas Wicker had been his colleague at Meridian. More than that, the kind of colleague you trust with the unfinished ideas, the half-built architecture you share because you believe the other person will help you make it better. Calvin had trusted Thomas with all of it. He had been wrong about that in a way that took him a long time to fully understand. The specifics were documented in 900 pages he no longer opened. The short version was that Thomas had used his access and his relationships inside Meridian to build a case against Calvin, a fabricated conduct complaint, a paper trail constructed carefully enough to look like a pattern. By the time Calvin understood what was happening, he was already outside the building, his keycard deactivated, his name removed from the project documentation. The patents were contested, and the legal fees consumed what remained of his savings. Thomas Wicker was promoted to Chief Innovation Officer 6 months later, on the strength of a system he had not built. Calvin had taken the facilities technician position at Meridian 14 months ago because it paid $18 an hour and asked no questions about a 7-year gap in his employment history. He told himself it was temporary. He arrived each morning through the service entrance on Spring Street, took the freight elevator to the basement, and became invisible by 9 o'clock. He had been invisible until this morning. The service order had been routine. Conference Room B1, 31st floor. Diagnose and repair the audio-visual system ahead of the 9 o'clock board session. Priority. High. Estimated time, 25 minutes. He had taken the freight elevator up alone, his toolkit in one hand, and a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in the other. The 31st floor was empty when he arrived. The hallway had the particular silence of expensive buildings, the kind of quiet that was engineered and maintained, a silence that cost money. His boots left no marks on the marble. The door to conference room B1 was unlocked. He pushed it in with his shoulder and set his toolkit beside the credenza. Long table, 14 chairs, 120-inch display on the far wall, currently dark. Laptop docked to the credenza, screen active. He crouched behind the unit, found the fault in 40 seconds, fixed it in 4 minutes. Stood, pressed the power button, watched the display warm from black to full brightness. The presentation was already loaded. Someone had connected the laptop the night before and left it queued. He read the title. He read it again. He picked up the clicker from the table. Slide 2. The system architecture diagram. A 3-tier structure in blue and gray, exactly as he had drawn it. Data ingestion layer on the left. Adaptive processing core at the center. Threshold response layer on the right. The spacing between the nodes, the weight of the connector lines, the visual logic of it. His, not an approximation. Not a design that resembled his. His slide 3. The alert subsystem detail, and there, along the right margin of the diagram, the node labels exactly as he had named them 7 years ago. N001, N002, N03, N4, N05, the N series. He had named them after Nora, not as a declaration, not as a signature anyone was meant to read. Just as the private thing an engineer does at 2 in the morning, when he is tired and working, and his daughter is asleep down the hall, and he is thinking about what he is building and why. He had never told anyone about it, not Diana, not anyone at Meridian, not Thomas. He clicked to slide 4, The volatility threshold table. 14 rows, 4 columns, the critical numbers that told the system when to hold and when to escalate. Row 7, column 3. The Gulf Coast deployment threshold. The value shown was 0. 19. Calvin stood completely still for 5 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the calculator. He ran the number against the historical volatility ranges for the Gulf Coast institutional markets listed in slide 2. The math took him 37 seconds. He had always been fast with numbers. At 0. 19, the Nova system would begin failing silently within 45 days of deployment. At 0. 28, the correct value. The value he had derived from 31 months of market data and validated through 600 simulated stress cycles, the system held. The difference between those two numbers was not a typo. It was not an error in transcription. It was a deliberate change made by someone who understood the system well enough to know exactly what that change would do and exactly how long it would take anyone to notice. He was still holding his phone when the doors opened. They entered the way powerful people enter rooms that have been expecting them. Without looking around. Without slowing. As though the room had been arranged specifically for their arrival and everything in it, including the air, existed to confirm that. Gerald Forsythe came in first, CEO of Meridian Financial Group. 63 years old, white-haired, in a charcoal suit that moved with him the way expensive fabric does, as though it had been constructed around his particular frame. He moved with the ease of a man who had not encountered a closed door in a very long time. Behind him came the board members, 9 of them, filing into their chairs with the practiced efficiency of people who spent their lives in exactly this kind of room. They arranged themselves by some unspoken protocol that everyone understood and no one had written down. Thomas Wicker came in last. He was 47. Lean, with a face that was easy to trust and difficult to read. Dark suit, slim portfolio under one arm. His hair had gone gray at the temples since Calvin had last been close enough to notice, and it made him look seasoned rather than old. He was mid-sentence when he came through the door, talking to the board member beside him, laughing at something with the warmth and ease of a man who felt entirely at home in this room. He had not seen Calvin yet. Calvin stood at the back beside the AV credenza, the clicker still in his hand, and he made a decision. He would set the clicker down. He would pick up his toolkit. He would take the freight elevator back to the basement. He would spend the rest of the day on the 22nd floor replacing conduit clamps and thinking about nothing in particular. Tonight he would drive to Midtown and have dinner with Nora, who made very good pasta and always pretended it was nothing. And none of what was on that screen would be his problem. He needed this job. He had learned, across 7 years of very expensive lessons, exactly what it cost to need things he was then prevented from having. He set the clicker on the credenza. He put his hand on the handle of his toolkit. Thomas Wicker stepped to the head of the presentation screen and said, "Good morning, everyone. Let's move quickly. I want time for questions before we go to signatures." He clicked to slide 1. The Nova 4.0 logo filled the screen. The deployment agreement with our Gulf Coast partners is finalized. Legal has signed off on both institutional contracts. All that remains is the board's authorization. Nova goes live across all 4 partner institutions in 11 days. 11 days. Calvin's hand was still on the handle of his toolkit. He thought about the number in row 7. He thought about what 45 days of silent system failure looked like inside 4 mid-size institutional investors who had been told their risk exposure was being managed. He thought about the accounts, the positions, the people who had handed their portfolios to an institution that had handed their trust to a system with the wrong number in its 7th row. He thought about Nora, about what she would think of him when she was older and understood everything, about the man he had been when he was building Nova, the man who believed that precision was a form of integrity, that getting the numbers right was not just professional obligation, but something closer to a promise. He thought about the last time he had trusted this company, what it had cost him, what it had cost his daughter to grow up, watching her father become someone who flinched. Thomas clicked to slide 4. The wrong number filled the 120-inch screen. Gerald Forsythe leaned forward in his chair and studied it, and nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man preparing to authorize something he trusted someone else had already verified. Calvin picked up his toolkit. He set it back down. Stop. The word came out the way it had always come out of him in the years when he was the person building things instead of the person fixing them. Not loud. Not performed. Just weighted, the way true things are weighted when they have been held too long. The room turned. 14 faces. 15 counting Thomas's. Thomas Wicker's eyes found Calvin across the length of the walnut table. For one fraction of 1 second, something moved in them. Something that arrived and was immediately managed and put away. Then his expression returned to what it had been. Professional. Composed. Faintly puzzled, in the way a person performs puzzlement when they are not actually puzzled at all. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Gerald Forsythe turned in his chair with the measured deliberateness of a man who had been interrupted and wanted the room to know it. His eyes traveled from Calvin's face to his uniform shirt to the Meridian Facilities logo on his chest. The assessment took less than 3 seconds and was complete. "Who are you?" Forsythe said. "Maintenance," said the board member nearest the door, as though the answer were self-evident, as though the uniform had already answered the question and the question had therefore not really needed to be asked. "I'm the technician who repaired your AV system this morning," Calvin said. "And before this meeting proceeds, there is a critical error in the deployment parameters on slide 4 that needs to be addressed." The room tightened. 2 board members exchanged a glance. One reached for his phone. One looked at the door with the expression of someone calculating how long this would take and whether he could afford to be delayed. Gerald Forsythe placed both palms flat on the table. "What qualifications," he said, each word set down separately, "do you have to speak in this room?" It was not a question. It was a perimeter. A line drawn in the marble between the man at the head of the table and the man in the gray uniform at the back of it. Several people were already looking somewhere else. Not out of discomfort. Out of the social instinct that averts its gaze from a predicted outcome. The conclusion, in their estimation, was already written. Thomas Wicker sat very still at the far end of the table. His portfolio was open in front of him. He held his presentation clicker loosely in his right hand, its button untouched. He was looking at a point approximately 2 feet to Calvin's left, with the specific concentration of a man who has identified a threat and decided that the most effective response to it is to give it no acknowledgement at all. Calvin looked at Forsythe. He did not look at the floor. He did not shift his weight. He did not do any of the things the body does when it is preparing to back down. 7 years. 7 years of freight elevators and service tickets, and learning to take up less space in rooms that used to feel like his. "My name is Calvin Reed," he said. "I built this system." Nobody moved. Forsythe's expression did not change, but something behind it did, some small recalibration, a brief flicker of something that was almost uncertainty. In 38 years of business, he had learned the difference between a person performing confidence and a person who simply had it. "You built this system," Forsythe said. "Not a question. A test. From first principles," Calvin said. 41 months of development. The architecture, the mathematical framework, the alert subsystem, all of it. The node labels in the alert layer, on slide 3, the N-series designation. I named them. I can tell you why I chose that letter, and I can tell you every design decision in this presentation, including the ones that are not on these slides. He walked to the screen. Not quickly. Not with any performance of urgency. The way he had always moved when he was working, with the deliberate economy of someone who knew exactly what the next step was. He pointed to the table on slide 4, row 7, column 3, the volatility threshold for Gulf Coast institutional deployment. The value shown is 0.19. He turned and faced the room. The correct value is 0.28. That number was changed deliberately by someone who understood this system at a level that goes well beyond surface familiarity. Because the difference between 0.19 and 0.28 is completely invisible in standard operations. You would only know to look for it if you understood the architecture from the inside. "That is a serious claim," said the board member on Forsythe's right, a heavy-set man named Russell Pratt who handled risk governance for the board. He was leaning forward now. His hands were flat on the table. "It's a number," Calvin said. "Let me show you what it means." He looked at Forsythe. "May I use the whiteboard?" A long moment. Forsythe gestured toward the wall. Calvin uncapped the marker and wrote 2 numbers side by side, 0.19 and 0.28. Under them he drew a simplified version of NOVA's volatility response curve. a line graph showing system behavior across a range of market conditions. His handwriting was fast and precise, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of drawing diagrams that other people's decisions depended on. Nova manages institutional risk adaptively, he said. It adjusts its behavior in real time based on observed market volatility. The threshold in Rossifin is the boundary of what the system classifies as normal fluctuation. Below that number, Nova operates in standard mode. Above it, the system escalates to high alert protocol and begins protective repositioning. The curve. At 0.28, the threshold captures the actual volatility range of the Gulf Coast markets in your deployment plan. The system stays calibrated. It works. He moved the marker to the left number. At 0.19, the threshold is set too low. Any spike above that level, and in these markets that happens multiple times per quarter, gets misclassified as a high-severity event. The system overcorrects. And here is the part that matters. He paused. Nova's alert subsystem includes a silent logging mode for sub-threshold fluctuations. It was a deliberate design choice to prevent alert fatigue from minor variance. Operators stop responding to warnings they've seen too many times. So minor anomalies below the threshold get logged internally without triggering visible alerts, keeping the signal clean. He set the marker down at 0.19. The overcorrections from misclassified events fall inside that silent zone. The system fails without announcing it. Your dashboards look normal. Your reports look normal. You get clean outputs right up until the moment the exposure is already too large to cover. The room was very quiet. Based on current projected deployment scale and the partner institution data in slide 6, Calvin said, "You are looking at undetected model drift within 45 days. By day 75, your partner institutions are holding unhedged positions they believe are covered. The financial exposure, conservatively, is in the range of 9 to 11 figures." Russell Pratt was sitting fully upright. His phone was face down on the table. Gerald Forsyth had not moved, but his eyes had not left Calvin since he stepped to the whiteboard. Then Thomas Wicker spoke. "He's accurate about the architecture," Thomas said. His voice was measured and easy, the voice of a man who had prepared for this moment, or something close to it, and had decided that the best navigation was to absorb rather than deflect. Calvin was part of the original Nova development team, but he left the company 7 years ago. The threshold values were updated in version 3.1 following a full review by our current engineering team. The parameters you're looking at reflect updated risk modeling. "Who conducted the review?" Calvin asked. Thomas paused, a pause of exactly the right length. "Our internal technical group." "Which members? Who specifically signed off on changing that threshold, and what dataset did they use to validate the new value against Gulf Coast market conditions?" Silence. Thomas's jaw moved by a fraction. "Those details are in our internal technical records." "Then pull them up," Calvin said. "Right now. I'll wait." The question that was now in the room was not the question that had been in the room when the board walked in. It was no longer, "Who is this man in the gray uniform?" It was something no one had been prepared to answer. Why does the man who built this system know it more precisely than the man who claims to own it? Thomas Wicker did not pull up the documentation. He did something more practiced than that. He set his presentation clicker on the table with a quiet, deliberate click and looked at Gerald Forsyth with the expression of a man who regrets having to redirect, but has no choice. "Gerald," he said, "I think we need to address something first." Forsyth said nothing. He was watching Calvin. Calvin Reed was separated from Meridian in 2017 following an internal conduct review. Thomas said he was removed from the Nova project specifically because of concerns raised about the integrity of his contributions and his behavior within the team. What we're actually looking at here is a former employee who has apparently been working in this building without disclosing his separation, walking into a confidential board session and attempting to disrupt a major institutional deployment. He paused. "That's not a technical dispute. That's a security matter." He looked toward the door. "Can someone contact building security?" Pratt looked at Calvin with the expression of a man who had just been handed a second interpretation and was weighing it against the first. "The conduct review was fabricated," Calvin said. His voice did not change. "Every document produced in that process was either manufactured or taken out of context to create the appearance of a pattern that did not exist. I have the original records. Of course you do, Thomas said. Something almost gentle entered his tone. Not sympathy, the performance of sympathy. Calvin, I genuinely don't want to relitigate this. But you have to understand what this looks like. A man in a maintenance uniform shows up in a confidential board meeting, makes claims that can't be verified on the spot, and asks the board to halt a 9-figure deployment based on his word against 7 years of documented record. Several board members were nodding. The specific nod of people who had been given a way back to the version of the morning they had originally expected, and were grateful for it. And Calvin felt it. The familiar weight of a room deciding collectively that the shape of a person was more legible than anything that person actually said. He had felt it in the HR office 7 years ago. He had felt it in the attorney's conference room. He had felt it in every subsequent context where the gap in his resume sat between him and whatever was on the other side of the table, something with its own gravity. He looked at the whiteboard, 2 numbers written in his own hand, 019 and 028. He looked at Thomas Wicker. Thomas was meeting his eyes for the first time since the meeting started, and Calvin could see it clearly now. The thing moving behind the composure. It was not contempt. It was not confidence. It was something more specific than either of those. It was the expression of a man who has carried a particular weight for a very long time and has just felt it shift. Calvin reached into his chest pocket and placed his phone face up on the walnut table. Before anyone calls security, he said, I want to ask one question. Not about me. Not about Thomas, about the system. He looked at Forsyth. The CEO had still not called for anyone to remove him. That meant something. Calvin registered it. The N-series alert nodes, Calvin said. The silent logging protocol. Who in this room can tell me why that design decision was made? Nobody answered. It was a deliberate architectural choice, Calvin said. Most institutional risk systems alert loudly on every anomaly, which creates alert fatigue. Operators start ignoring warnings. Nova was built differently. Minor anomalies below a defined threshold get logged internally without triggering visible alerts. It keeps the signal clean and the alert meaningful. He paused. That design only works if the threshold is correctly set, which is exactly why the number in row 7 is not a minor detail. It is the entire system. He looked at Thomas. You have presented this architecture to this board. Tell the room why the N-series uses silent logging for sub-threshold events. 3 seconds of silence. Thomas's composure held. His hands were flat on the portfolio. The rationale is documented in the technical specifications. I know it is, Calvin said. I wrote the documentation. I'm asking whether you know the answer. Forsyth leaned forward, Mr. Reed. It was the first time he had used Calvin's name. Calvin noted that. If what you are saying about the threshold value is accurate, Forsyth said carefully, what are you proposing? 10 minutes of access to the Nova Development Repository, Calvin said. Not the presentation materials. Not the documentation Thomas's team prepared. The raw commit history from the original build, the code that was written before my separation. I will show you something embedded in the original architecture that cannot be replicated, cannot be retroactively inserted, and cannot be explained by anyone who did not write it. He held Forsyth's gaze. If I can't find it in 10 minutes, I'll leave this room and you'll never hear from me again. If I find it, then you have a decision to make before anyone signs anything today. Thomas stood up. Gerald, we are not handing system access to a terminated employee in the middle of a board meeting. He is not asking you, Forsyth said. The room went very still. Something passed between Forsyth and Thomas. The specific moment when a senior executive recognizes that the trust he extended to someone may not have been warranted. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and final, like a door closing in another room. Gerald, Thomas started. Sit down, Thomas. Thomas sat down. Forsyth looked at Pratt. Get it on the line. Pull up the original Nova Development Repository. He checked his watch. 10 minutes, Mr. Reed. Calvin exhaled once through his nose. He picked up his phone and walked to the side of the screen, not to the head of the table, to the place where the work happened, which was the only position he had ever wanted anyway. He thought about Nora. About the Sunday evening calls and the way she always said goodbye as though she expected him to be fine and knew he would be. He thought about the folder on his laptop he had not opened in 3 years. He thought, this is for all of it. Every morning I woke up at 5 and became invisible by 9, all of it. Thank you, he said to Forsyth. Then he got to work. The IT administrator who joined the video call was named Bethany. She was 28 and had clearly been pulled from something else and had the focused calm of someone who had learned to be useful in situations she didn't fully understand. She shared her screen to the conference room display and navigated to the repository management portal and waited. "I need the Nova repository," Calvin said, "the main branch. Pre-September 2017. Before the first major revision under the new team." Bethany typed. The terminal window opened. Lines of commit history scrolled up the 120-inch screen. Thousands of entries, each one time-stamped, each one a record of a decision made at a specific moment by a specific person. "Go to August 2016, Calvin said. "Look for a commit labeled N-Series Initialization. Core Architecture Build." Bethany scrolled, found it, opened it. "Now open the subdirectory labeled Threshold Config. Inside that, find the file called N-Series Core Env. Open it in the text editor." She opened it. A configuration file appeared on the screen. Hundreds of lines of parameter definitions and variable assignments. To every person in the room except Calvin, it looked like the interior of a machine. Precise, impenetrable, written in a language that required years of fluency to read. "Scroll to line 388, Calvin said. Bethany scrolled. Line 388 appeared on the 120-inch display. It was a comment line. The kind a developer writes to annotate their code, invisible to the running system, readable only to a human being who opens the file and knows where to look. Comment lines do not affect how the software runs. They are notes from the person who wrote it, sometimes to their future self, sometimes to whoever comes after. This one read, "CR August 2016, Nora's Rule, a system that fails without saying so is not a system. It is a lie." The room did not make a sound. Calvin read it on the screen and felt something pass through him that he could not have named in the moment. Not triumph, not vindication. Something more complicated than either of those. Something that had been waiting in him for a very long time and had just been allowed to stop waiting. He had written that line at 11:40 on a Tuesday night in August 2016. Nora had been a teenager. She had fallen asleep on the couch with a book across her chest, the way she used to do, and he had carried her to her room without waking her and then gone back to his desk and kept working. And he had written that line because it was true. Because the thing he feared most in any system he built was the failure that announced itself to no one, that produced clean outputs until suddenly it didn't, and by then everything was already too late. He had named it after his daughter because she was asleep down the hall, and he was thinking about what kind of world he was building and what it would mean to build it honestly. He had never told anyone about it. Not Diana. Not anyone at Meridian. Not Thomas. That comment, Calvin said, is in a commit from August 2016, 14 months before my separation from this company. The name Nora is my daughter's name. Nora's Rule was what I called the core silent logging design principle internally. No one outside my own head ever heard that phrase. He turned, faced the room. If someone other than me built this system, I need them to explain that line. The silence was absolute. Thomas Wicker had gone very still. His thumb was pressing the edge of his portfolio with a steady, repeating pressure. His eyes were on the screen. On line 388. On 11 words written on a Tuesday night in 2016 by a man who had just carried his daughter to bed. Thomas. Gerald Forsyth's voice had changed. Not louder. The opposite. Quieter in the specific way that very serious things go quiet. "Is there anything you want to say?" Thomas looked at the screen. He looked at the comment. He looked at Calvin, and for the first time since Calvin had said, "Stop across the length of that walnut table," there was nothing behind his eyes that was being managed or curated. There was just a man who had run out of room between himself and something that had been true for a very long time. "I want to speak with legal counsel," Thomas said. 4 words. And in those 4 words, 7 years of architecture collapsed. Quietly, without alarm. In the plain and irreversible language of a man who had just told the room everything it needed to know. What happened next did not look like justice. It looked like paperwork. There was no scene of public reckoning, no moment of dramatic confession. What there was instead was this. Thomas Wicker left the conference room with 2 members of Meridian's legal team who appeared within 15 minutes of Russell Pratt's call. He walked past the walnut table and past the whiteboard with the 2 numbers still written on it and past Calvin Reed, and he did not look at Calvin. He looked at the floor, and then at the door, and then he was gone, His slim leather portfolio remained on the table, his presentation clicker on top of it, objects that had stopped belonging to him. Gerald Forsyth asked Bethany to preserve and archive the full repository access log from the session. He asked Pratt to initiate an independent technical review of every threshold value in the Nova 4.0 deployment package. He issued a hold on all deployment authorizations, effective immediately. He said all of this in the same measured tone he used for quarterly earnings calls, as though the situation could be contained if it was addressed calmly enough. And perhaps that was true. Calvin did not know yet. There was a lot he did not yet know. Pratt was the first board member to speak to Calvin directly. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, and he looked at Calvin for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing a calculation he had gotten wrong. The threshold value, Pratt said. If we had deployed at 019. 45 days to first failure, Calvin said. 75 days to material exposure across all 4 partner institutions. Pratt nodded once and said nothing else. He did not need to. Forsyth came back to the room 27 minutes later, closed the door behind him, and sat directly across the table from Calvin. Mr. Reed. Mr. Forsyth. A moment. Forsyth was a man who chose his words carefully, and was willing to take the time to find the right ones rather than reaching for the wrong ones quickly. I owe you an apology, Forsyth said, for this morning, for the question I asked you. Calvin looked at him. The one about my qualifications, yes. You didn't know who I was, Calvin said. That's not what I need an apology for. Forsyth seemed to understand that. He folded his hands on the table. What happens next will take time. The legal process, the IP review, the internal investigation. I won't pretend otherwise. But I want to be direct with you. If the documentation supports what you've shown us today, and based on what I have seen in the last hour I believe it will, Meridian has a significant obligation. To you personally, and to the record. I'll want independent legal representation, Calvin said, and I want it on record from this point forward that Nova was built by me. Not a collaborative effort, not a team output. Mine. I understand, Forsyth said. A pause. What you did this morning, Forsyth said, standing up in this room, knowing what it would cost you if you were wrong, or if we didn't listen. That took something. Calvin looked at the whiteboard. The 2 numbers were still there, 019 and 028. The difference between a system that fails and a system that holds. I have a daughter, Calvin said. It changes how you calculate risk. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, Thomas Wicker appeared before Meridian's board in a closed session. The independent technical investigation had been concluded. The findings were thorough and not in dispute. The threshold change in Nova 4.0 had been traced to a manual edit in the configuration file, made under Thomas's credentials, 14 months before the planned deployment. The edit was not documented in any review record because no review had been conducted. The internal documentation submitted to the board in support of the changed value had been fabricated. Multiple patent filings bearing Calvin Reed's name, which had been reassigned through a legal process that the investigation found to have relied on fraudulent conduct complaints, were identified for restoration. Thomas Wicker was terminated that morning. The civil proceedings that followed were not quick. They were not clean. But they were thorough, and Calvin had spent 7 years building a documentation folder that had 900 pages in it and had never once been wrong. He sat in an attorney's conference room on Peachtree Center Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon in October, signing documents that had his name in the right places, and he felt something he could not quite locate the word for. Not elation, not relief exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a weight that had been set down, not dropped, not thrown, just carefully and finally set down by a man who had carried it long enough. He thought about Thomas, not with satisfaction, with something more complicated than that. Thomas Wicker had once been a person who was good at his work. Calvin had seen it, had trusted it, had shared his best unfinished ideas with it. Whatever Thomas had become afterward was the result of choices he had made, one at a time, each one requiring him to know what he was doing, and do it anyway. Calvin did not know how you lived with that. He was glad he did not have to find out. On a Sunday evening in November, Nora came to the apartment for dinner. She sat at the kitchen table while Calvin made pasta from scratch, which he had not done in years, which required significantly more counter space than the apartment comfortably provided, and which she watched with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to offer help or whether offering help would insult the effort. She did not offer help. She said, "You seem different." Calvin was rolling dough and did not look up. "Different how? Like how you were when I was little before." She paused. "You stopped carrying it the same way." He stood at the counter for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the parking lot was lit by a single amber street lamp, and beyond it, the oak trees on Flat Shoals Road moved slightly in the November air. "Something stopped," he said. "The thing with your old job?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going back to that kind of work?" He thought about that. About what going back meant after 7 years of going somewhere else entirely. About whether the man who had written Nora's rule at 11:40 on a Tuesday night was the same man standing at this counter, or someone related to him, someone who had learned things the other man had not yet needed to know. "I'm working on figuring that out," he said. She nodded, apparently satisfied with that, the way she had always been satisfied with answers that were honest even when they were incomplete. She picked up a glass of water and held it, with both hands the way she had always held things, with her whole grip, nothing halfway. He had always loved that about her. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you never stopped being that person. I just think some rooms made it hard to stand up in." He set the rolling pin down. He looked at his daughter. He did not say anything for a long moment. He turned back to the counter and kept working. After dinner, when Nora had gone home and the kitchen was clean and the apartment was quiet, Calvin opened his laptop. He navigated to the folder labeled Nova Original. He sat with his hand on the mouse for a moment. Then he opened it. 912 pages. He did not read them. He had read them enough times. He just looked at them. The way you look at something you carried a long distance to prove it was real. He closed the folder. He put the laptop on the coffee table and sat on the couch for a while without the television on. The radiator knocked twice. Outside on the street, a car passed slowly. The amber light from the street lamp came through the gap in the curtains and made a line across the floor. He looked at his phone. There was a name in his contacts he had not called in 4 years. A colleague from before, a man named Dwight, who had left Meridian 6 months before everything happened, and had sent Calvin a message when the news broke about Thomas Wicker and the investigation, a message that said only, "I always knew. I should have said so sooner. I'm sorry." Calvin looked at the name for a moment. Then he put the phone face down on the cushion beside him. He sat in the quiet apartment and listened to the city go about its ordinary Thursday evening business with complete indifference to what had been settled on the 31st floor of a glass building downtown. The city was like that. It didn't remember. It just kept moving. He thought about a comment line in a configuration file. 11 words written at 11:40 on a Tuesday night in August 2016, which had waited in the dark of a repository for 7 years. For someone to look at them and understand what they meant. A system that fails without saying so is not a system. It is a lie. He had named that principle after his daughter because she was asleep down the hall and he was building something, and he wanted it to be honest. Not for anyone else. Just because that was the kind of work he knew how to do. He was done being invisible. That wasn't something he had decided in a boardroom in a single dramatic moment. It was something that had been true for a long time, and that he had finally allowed himself to act on. The amber light made its line across the floor. The radiator was quiet now. Outside, the oak trees on Flat Shoals Road moved in the November air. He got up. He turned off the light. He went to bed. Here is what this story leaves behind, not just as a narrative, as something worth sitting with. The systems we build to assess human worth, by appearance, by title, by the logo on a shirt or the floor someone enters through, those systems have thresholds too. And when the thresholds are set wrong, they fail silently. They produce clean outputs. They tell us everything is fine, right up until the moment they don't. Calvin Reed did not walk into that conference room to prove anything to anyone. He walked in because the truth needed someone willing to say it out loud. And he happened to be the only person in the building who actually knew what the truth was. That is not a story about one man. It is a story about what we lose as institutions, as industries, as a society, every time we let a job title or a zip code or a uniform stand in for actual judgment. And it is a story about what happens to the people who carry something real inside them through rooms that were never designed to recognize it. You probably know someone like Calvin. Maybe you've been Calvin. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that a person's value has nothing to do with how they enter the building, then you already understand the lesson. Dignity is not given, it is recognized. And the people who refuse to recognize it in others are the ones who lose it first. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever watched someone be underestimated and then discovered who they really were? Or been that person yourself? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary things through rooms that weren't ready for them, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.